All right, y'all, this is 17B, practice with proofs. Now, in this exercise, you had some sentences that you had to translate into the proper form. So I'm going to read the sentences so you can see how it translated. If evolutionary theory is correct, then the biblical creation account is false. There's the negation there. However, if the Bible is God's word, then the biblical creation account is true. Therefore, if evolutionary theory is correct, then the Bible is not God's word. So there's the negation there for that, God's word. So I went ahead and wrote this out. Now, what we're going to do first is look at the conclusion. If you remember, that's kind of what we always start with. So what we have here is a conditional with an E and a not G. So we're going to come over here to our proofs and find where E and G are. So we've got E in this first one. It's also in a conditional. And we've got G in the second line, which is also a conditional. But I want you to notice something about G. Over here in our conclusion, it's in the consequent and it's negated. Over here in our proof, it's the antecedent and it's not negated. So we want to look and see if there's a rule that will help us change or switch positions of our variables in a conditional. So I'm going to bring this over here so you can see it. Okay. All right. So if you notice down here, we just kind of look like we've done always. We're looking for a conditional and a conditional that stays a conditional. And if you notice, this one here has a conditional on both sides. And let's check the variables here. On this side, we have P and Q. And then on this side, all they did was switch places. And something else you should notice is not only did they switch places, but they negated both terms, or both variables. So unnegated P and Q, or if P then Q, and then negated Q, if negated Q, then negated P. So that is what we need here, and it's transposition. And if you guys can remember this, we kind of talked about it, is transposition, switching positions. Those variables switch positions, and they get negated there. Okay, so what we're going to do first is that right there, we're taking number 2. We are going to change the positions, or changing the positions and negating both. So see, we took the G, put it in the consequent, took the C and put it in the antecedent position, and we negated both. And what we did was we did line 2, and the rule was transposition. And you can abbreviate. I don't know why I went on and spelled that whole entire word. All right, so now if we look at what we have the G negated, and it's in the right position. It's in the consequent. So how are we going to get, how are we going to use these proofs here to get to this one? Now, a clue when you have this many conditionals is hypothetical syllogism is probably going to be what you're going to be using. So let's review what hypothetical syllogism is here. If P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. Again, it takes the antecedent of the first premise and is the antecedent of the conclusion, and the consequent of the second premise is the consequent of the conclusion. So because we need E as our antecedent in the conclusion, we need to find a proof over here that has E in the antecedent. There is 1 right there, so I'm going to use 1. And now I know that not G is my consequent, so my second premise this is the conclusion. Okay, so not G is my conclusion. So I need to come over here and find a proof that has not G in its consequent, which is this one that I was just pointing to over here. So what it becomes is E. If E, then not G. And that's our fourth line there. And what we used was hypothetical syllogism. Now I'm going to bring this over here. I'm going to rewrite this hypothetical syllogism over here so you can get really familiar with what we're doing and how it is turning into these things. So my first premise was 1. If E, then not C. My second premise was 3. If not C, then not G. Therefore, my conclusion is if E, then not G. So first premise, the antecedent is the antecedent of our conclusion. Second premise, the consequent is the same as our consequent in our conclusion. So see how that lined up? And we used hypothetical syllogism, and we just proved our conclusion there. Okay, so now let's move on to number 2. I'm going to read what you had to translate again. Okay. So, it is impossible both to spend eternity in heaven and be condemned to hell. So, if you go to heaven, you will not be condemned to hell. Okay, so it's impossible to both. There's the conjunction. Impossible to both go spend eternity in heaven and be condemned to hell. So that's why it's isolated with the parentheses, because it's a both and impossible for both of those things. Okay, so moving on to the first step is we look at our conclusion. We have a conditional and an H and a not C. And comparing that with what we have over here, which is a negated conjunction with H and C there. So, is there a rule of replacement that would allow you to go from a conjugation to a conditional? No. But what can you get a conditional from? So, we're going to look at these over here and find something that goes from something to a conditional here. So, let's look here. And where do we have a conditional? Okay, here, right here. We have a conditional that switches to a disjunction here. Okay, well, we don't have a disjunction in our proof. So is there a disjunction that can come from what we do have, which is this conjunction here? And if you notice up here, you can go switch back and forth between a conjunction and a disjunction. So we're going to use De Morgan's theorem to get the disjunction we need to be able to use the implication down here to go from a disjunction to the conditional there. All right, so let's look at the De Morgan's theorem here. And we are starting with a conjunction. So that, and if you look, that looks very familiar to what we had. Parentheses conjunction with a negated on the outside. And then the disjunction becomes, if you notice, both terms are negated with an or. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to write both terms, and then I'm going to negate both. So not H or not C. And I used line number 1, and I used De Morgan's theorem. Okay, so now I have that disjunction that I need. And remember, I have to go from a disjunction to a conditional. So let's look at the one that we had for here, which was material implication. Okay, so it allows me to go from the disjunction over to the conditional. Now, if you notice, we're starting with a disjunction here. So there's a negated P or a negated term, or not negated, but ours was negated. So what we have to do is compare what happens. So the P goes negated or switches value, not or not. And the Q just stays the same. So what we're going to do over here is the H will become opposite of what it is, which means it will drop its negation. And the other variable will stay the same. So that will stay not C. So we used line 2 and implication there. Okay. So that is your 17B. Exercises 1 and 2. And I hope that helped and made some sense.